I think that sometimes we get so caught up in this idea of getting to the 0% tax bracket at all costs that we fail to do the math along the way to see if the cost of doing so actually makes sense. We're so terrified of rising taxes that we reflexively pay taxes today, regardless of the cost. And so here's the bottom line. It may make sense for you to get that 50% tax deduction today because you may not, in fact, be in a higher tax bracket down the road. Now, of course, how many Americans does this sort of apply to? We're talking about the top 1%, even if we're talking about the top 5%. But these principles are nonetheless true. It comes down to, will the tax today be higher or lower than the tax that we pay somewhere down the road? Remember, if we say in an effort to avoid a doubling of tax rates over time, we double our tax rates in the short term, then mathematically, that's not a strategy that will likely vindicate itself over time.
A tax freight train is bearing down on your retirement. To protect yourself, you'll have to harness the power of zero.
Welcome to the Power of Zero show. This is your host, David McKnight, best-selling author of The Power of Zero, Look Before You Lerp, The Volatility Shield, Tax-Free Income for Life, and the soon-to-be-released The Infinity Code. If you're looking for someone to help you navigate all of the pitfalls that stand between you and the 0% tax bracket, why not head over to davidmcknight.com and be happy to connect you with a member of our elite POZ advisor group. Among the very best tax-free retirement planning specialists in the nation, trained, vetted, qualified personally by me. If you are a financial advisor and looking to level up your game and adopt Power of Zero principles into your financial planning practice, then head over to powerofzero.com and opt into the free 3-part video series. At any point during that series, you can set up a phone call to chat with our team. If you're looking to buy any of my books in single copy, you're better off doing so at amazon.com. And if you're buying my books in bulk, head over to davemcknightbooks.com where you can mix and match titles to achieve bulk discounts. Of course, would always appreciate a follow on Twitter. It's at McKnight & Co., at McKnight & Co., or on Instagram, David C. McKnight. Would also love a subscribe on my YouTube channel. There's a lot of good content that's going up over there on the daily. That account is aptly titled David McKnight. That's David McKnight. All right, for today's podcast, I'd like to talk about a little case study, a little scenario. I came across this last week with a couple. And between the two of them, they made $650,000 per year, and they wanted to know if they should consider doing a Roth conversion. Now, let me give you some of the details of their case before we dive into my response. So they had about $1.5 million in their old IRAs and 401ks. They're both age 50, and their lifestyle need was around $100,000 after tax. They also had about $1 million in their liquid savings in their taxable bucket, and they were contributing $100,000 per year to that bucket and just growing it in plain old taxable mutual funds. And finally, very important fact, they live in California, so that should tell you something about the state tax. Talk about that here in a second. So given what we know about their situation, should they do a Roth conversion? Now, normally we say, hey, they're under 59 and a half. We have to make sure that they have money in their taxable bucket with which to pay the tax on that Roth conversion. Well, this couple happens to have about $1 million in their taxable bucket, so they could, in theory, execute a Roth conversion and pay the tax on that conversion out of the taxable bucket itself. But the question becomes, should they do so? Before we make any reflexive decisions about whether they should do a Roth conversion, let's consider the facts. They're in the highest marginal tax bracket, so that's 37%. Throw in another 11.3% for California state tax. So were they to do a Roth conversion, they would be paying tax on top of all their other income, and they would be paying tax at 48.3%. In other words, they'd be giving away nearly half of whatever portion of their IRAs or 401ks they converted back to the IRS. The question is, does it make sense for a couple of 50-year-olds to undertake a Roth conversion at these tax rates? Remember, the whole justification for doing a Roth conversion is because you think that the rates at which you'd be forced to pay in the future are going to be higher than the rates that you might have to pay today. So if the answer to that question is yes, then you should preemptively pay that tax. You should pay the tax today before the IRS absolutely requires it of you somewhere down the road at higher rates. However, if you don't, in your heart of hearts think that taxes down the road are going to be higher than they are today, then you should not do a Roth conversion. It's really that simple. Full stop. End of story. Now, what factors might persuade you that your taxes down the road won't be higher than they are today? Well, first, you may not be convinced that the fiscal condition of the country is so bad that there would be a swing in taxes so great to the point where it doesn't make sense to preemptively pay those taxes today. Or you anticipate that your income in retirement will be dramatically lower than your income during your working years. Maybe you earn a lot of money today, but won't need a lot of money to fund your lifestyle in retirement. So either one of these factors could lead you to believe that you will be in a lower tax bracket in retirement. And you know what? That is a totally reasonable position to hold. I think that sometimes we get so caught up in this idea of getting to the 0% tax bracket at all costs that we fail to do the math along the way to see if the cost of doing so actually makes sense. We're so terrified of rising taxes that we reflexively pay taxes today regardless of the cost. And so here's the bottom line. It may make sense for you to get that 50% tax deduction today because you may not, in fact, be in a higher tax bracket down the road. Now, of course, how many Americans does this sort of apply to? We're talking about the top 1%, even if we're talking about the top 5%. But these principles are nonetheless true. It comes down to, will the tax today be higher or lower than the tax that we pay somewhere down the road? Remember, if we say in an effort to avoid a doubling of tax rates over time, we double our tax rates in the short term, then mathematically, that's not a strategy that will likely vindicate itself over time. So when do Roth conversions make sense? They tend to make sense for people who will be in similar income ranges in retirement. Now, notice I didn't say similar income tax brackets. I said similar income ranges in retirement, particularly if they are currently in the 22 or 24% tax brackets. For example, let's say you're currently in the 22% tax bracket. You have taxable income of $100,000. Does it make sense to do a Roth conversion at least to the top of your 22% tax bracket? Almost certainly. So that means that you can convert an additional $78,150 this year. Oh, and by the way, the 24% tax bracket is only 2% more, so why not convert to the top of that tax bracket as well? So for an additional 2% on the margin, you could reposition an extra $161,950 to the tax-free bucket. This particularly makes sense, and starting in 2026, that 22% becomes 25% and the 24% becomes 28%. In other words, the current 24% tax bracket is still lower than the post-2026 version of the current 22% tax bracket, which is 25%. That kind of math makes a lot of sense to me. However, if we're talking about paying a 50% tax today, foregoing a 50% tax deduction today, because we think that the tax on a $100,000 lifestyle down the road is going to be even higher, then that's a heavy-handed, sort of irrational approach to take. It's a let's get to the 0% tax bracket or bust, no matter the cost. In short, we shouldn't be adopting a Roth conversion or bust attitude when it comes to insulating ourselves against higher taxes down the road. We need to take a measured, rational approach. By paying taxes today, will we be sparing ourselves from a higher tax somewhere down the road? Maybe not. We have to sharpen our pencils and do the math and make sure it all adds up. What we don't want to do is to allow ourselves to become so consumed by the fear of higher tax rates that we make irrational decisions about the timing of our tax payments. We have to be thoughtful. We have to be patient. We have to be methodical. We can't undertake these decisions in a reflexive way and a reflexive, fear-driven sort of a way. Okay, so let's go back to this client's case. What would we recommend, if not a Roth conversion? Well, you have to remember that they're at the highest marginal tax bracket today. And while that may not justify doing a Roth conversion, it almost certainly justifies getting that $1 million in their taxable bucket systematically repositioned as free. Now, remember, the higher your marginal tax rate, the more it makes sense to get money moved out of the taxable bucket and into the tax-free bucket. Here's an example. Let's say your taxable bucket grow at 8%, and that was all short-term capital gains. That means that at a 50% marginal tax rate, half of that 8% growth would go to taxes. So you'd net just 4% after tax, subtract 1.5% for expenses, and you're not even really keeping up with inflation. Not a very efficient way to grow your investments in that bucket. So you might instead consider systematically shifting that money to tax-free. Now remember, not only does this couple have $1 million in their taxable bucket, but they're contributing $100,000 to that bucket per year. This is a classic case where it may make sense to utilize the tax-free qualities of the LIRP, the Life Insurance Retirement Plan. Remember what we're doing with the Life Insurance Retirement Plan. We're getting as little death benefit as the IRS requires of us. We're stuffing as much money into it as the IRS allows in an attempt to mimic all of the tax-free benefits of the Roth IRA without any of the limitations of the Roth IRA. So remember, by shifting those contributions and a portion of the principal to the LIRP over time, let's just take a look at the efficiencies that we're creating. You can still expect 1.5% expenses per year over the life of the program in the LIRP, but the growth is going to be 100% tax-free. And you're doing it without taking any more risk than what you're accustomed to taking in your savings account. So guess what? If you can get 6.5% net of fees in your LIRP without taking any more risk than what you're accustomed to taking in your savings account, that's a pretty safe and productive way to grow at least a portion of your savings. So in summary, we need to be very thoughtful when we're evaluating whether we should be executing Roth conversions. We need to think about the tax deduction we are foregoing. And we need to think about what our tax rate will likely be somewhere down the road, even given the fact that we are in a rising tax rate environment. We could be in a rising tax rate environment and still be in a lower tax bracket down the road, depending on what our current income is and depending on what our lifestyle is down the road. We also have to remember that it may not make sense to do a Roth conversion today if we're in a high marginal tax bracket. However, that may be the perfect time to start shifting surplus assets and surplus contributions for that matter from your taxable bucket to your tax-free bucket. And one of the very best ways to do that is by way of the LIRP. Why? Because the LIRP has no contribution limits and no income limitations. So let's just be thoughtful about how we're doing Roth conversions. And remember, if it doesn't make sense to do a Roth conversion, it almost certainly makes sense to be doing a shift from our taxable bucket to the tax-free bucket by way of the LIRP. Okay, that is the show for today, folks. Again, if you're looking for help navigating all of this, we're happy to lend a hand. Head over to davemcknight.com. Happy to connect you with a member of our elite POZ advisor group. And if you are an advisor who wants to start assimilating these types of principles into your financial planning practice, head over to powerofzero.com. I really appreciate you spending time with me each and every week, and I look forward to chatting with you same time next week.